Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Ken.
I'm Tony.
Thank you guys for attending this morning. So this is going to be a purchase contract, I guess class, Tony?
Yeah, it'll
What
be a
we
little
call
bit different than the ones that one that just got taught by Chad, and Chad and I used to teach together. But a little background is that Kent is on the horror team, and so anytime they had an issue, they would go to Kent, and I was PB principal broker at the time, and then we would kind of like have to dissect the contract because it was always like a new issue that came up, and so then we got together not that long ago and thought about just dissecting the purchase contract, reading it line by line, so everybody knows what it is. And as I was telling Charmaine, they change it so often that what you thought was there 6 months ago is no longer there. So it's really important to familiarize yourself with each version. I also sit on the Hawaii Association of Realtors Contracts Committee Forum. I'm on the committee for the new purchase contract, which has been taking like 6 months. And so I can tell you that one's going to be, there'll be a lot of changes in that one as well. So this is the one that we're going to be working with, which is revised in 4/22 and released in November, just a couple months ago.
Okay.
Until the new one comes out.
Cool.
So there'll be a lot of reading. Everybody's going to have to participate, take a paragraph. Ken will pick on you. And then we'll go through, like if you have questions on what you're reading, or if there's a situation that has come up where, first off, how many people have actually written a purchase contract before? Okay. And so everybody
Two.
else have not written one yet?
Myself.
Okay. Okay.
Anyone go through a transaction? I guess you guys haven't at all because you haven't even written the contract. So you've got the
Just
contract
right
line.
now, I'm like that.
Oh, you're in one now? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, congratulations on that.
Congratulations on that. Yeah, so no matter how long you've been in the business, because I've been in since 1985, I'm still learning all the time. So I don't know everything. I learn from Kent, or we have a situation that comes up that comes across my desk, and we kind of have to dissect the contract to either get an attorney and not get an attorney. Not here to scare you, but it is a legally binding contract, so.
Yeah, so the format for the class, the way that we've done this before. So I've taught this class here at KW for new agents as well as on the hire team. And the way that to me was most effective, as Tony mentioned, is to actually go through the entire contract and read it line by line. So it's a lot of class participation. I'll call on you and we just kind of go in order where you're gonna actually read the provision that we're on. And then I want it to be interactive. So as we're reading through, we may stop you and we may further elaborate on that sentence or on that provision. Maybe even share a story, or if you guys have questions as we go along, please stop us and ask the question. Because to me, that's the best way to learn, right? If you have something that comes up while we're talking about it, bring up your question, and then we can kind of go through that. So that's why it's such a long session. I mean, we have 2 hours, 5 sessions. And if we're successful, it'll kind of go pretty quick because there's just a lot of ground to cover. You had mentioned you guys would normally go through this in one class?
Yeah, well, Chad just did it, so we would
Okay.
normally do it, but it was basically about how to write a purchase contract.
Okay.
For if you're representing the buyer, or
Right.
what to look for if you're representing the seller.
Right, okay. Yeah, this is more how it works, how you apply it, and questions that come up throughout the transaction, I guess you can ask questions on that. The other comment I would make is, so I've gone through this a lot, the purchase contract. The role that I had on the hire team was to be their chief negotiator. So I don't do that anymore. But while I was doing that role, I had to represent all of our sellers for our transactions. And we would do, gosh, they do a lot more now. Back then, maybe I do like 2 to 3 a month. So I'd have to negotiate and get it through closing from when the offers come in, all the way through closing. So in that process, I got a lot of reps and I got a lot of different views on how other agents, buyers agents, right? Because I'm representing always the seller side, how buyers agents would interpret things and how they would go about getting through escrow. So that's my background. I've been in real estate now for about 12, 13 years. Part of that, I was in tech sales. So went from tech sales to real estate.
To elaborate a minute on what Kent said, on the forms committee, everybody in the committee is probably 15 years or more in real estate, and we still interpret everything differently. We don't always see eye to eye, which is the reason why it takes so long to revise contracts, for the board.
Yeah, an interesting point about that. When I first started in real estate, you look at the contract, it's long, yes, but it's the same, basically the same contract year after year with tweaks. So what I thought interesting is that you'd have senior agents that would be supporting the newer agents. And anytime I would ask one of the senior agents a question, the good ones anyway, the first thing that they're gonna do is they're gonna pull the contract and they're gonna look and read the section that I had a question about, which I found kind of interesting. I'm going like, these guys, they are supposed to be knowledgeable. However, why do they have to read it? They should have gone through this many times already. And to Tony's point, it's always about what's happening at the time. What is that situation? And then how does the contract, how do you apply that situation to that term or that provision in the contract? That's why it gets tricky a lot of times. And Tony has been super helpful to me. I have a few stories as we go through it that I can share where he's giving me so much guidance on how to handle that situation, right? So hopefully you guys will find this helpful. At the end of the day, it's important to know this, but as new agents, my advice to you would be, this is great. You've got to know this. This will give you a lot of confidence with your clients, but without any business, this is meaningless, right? So, and this is not a KW commercial. This is just my advice. Go to Bold, work on your sphere, work on your database, make your calls, and connect with people. Because if you don't have business, this doesn't mean anything. Yeah. So just a bit of advice.
Just Kent's tips.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Shall we start?
Yep.
Okay, so we're gonna start at the top, and I guess we'll go this way. Okay. And I'm sorry, I'm super bad with names. So I may have to just point. I haven't met everyone yet. And those that have been, I probably already forgot your name except for Sunshine. I love your name.
So there are copies of the purchase contract.
You guys all have
on the round table, and there's also some highlighters. So you can kind of really highlight. And if you haven't had a class with Chemo Stone, he does do some classes for us. He's, an attorney that that the board uses. As Ken said, he pulls out his newest version of the purchase contract, and it's all highlighted because he always references that. And so anytime there's a dispute between the buyer and the seller, a lot of agents, they'll get personal about it, but we always say, what does the contract state? Because that's where the law is.
Yep. Okay, so I'll start. How's that? I'll start. And you finish, I guess. We'll go this way.
Okay.
All right. So at the top, purchase contract. So under that, Hawaii Association of Realtors standard form. Under that, revised 422 for release 1122. So that information right there, revised and for release, important to know. As new agents, right? There's just all this information, and a lot of it when I first started, I was like, that's kind of meaningless. I don't need to know that. Well, it is important because especially when you go through a new release. What are the dates on that, Tony? There are standard new forms, right, that come out. Is it every
It's usually
October?
like twice a year. October. It's either they revise it either in May or April, and then it has to go out to the board, and then they get comments, and then they look at the comments, and then they schedule a release for either September or November.
Okay, it's important to know the release because if you're working on a purchase contract for the buyer and you have them, you fill it out, you have them sign it, or you fill it out and you send it to the broker for signature, and you happen to have the old release, they are probably going to kick it back to you and say, redo it. So just be aware of that. Yeah. Under that, I'm not going to read this copyright and trademark because that doesn't really mean too much there. Under that, reviewed by, and then you'll have your broker in charge or your principal broker. So when you're filling out your purchase contract for the buyer, you have to absolutely make sure, as you guys all know, right? You have to have it signed off by your broker, right? I think what happens is if it's signed off, then
It's good to go out to the buyer or the seller.
but also the insurance part.
Yeah,
right? What is that called?
you know.
Will apply, so you're covered. If it's not signed, you're on your own, kind of deal, right?
And a lot of times the brokers won't want to sign it if it's already been signed off by the buyer.
Yeah, so broker first and then out to the buyer. Then you have your reference date. Reference date is the date that you're putting it together. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the date that goes out to the other side, right?
Right.
It's just a date that you put it together, your broker signs, and then does the reference date have to be the same as the date that the buyer signs? Doesn't have to be, right?
It should be unless the agent wrote it a couple of days prior to.
Mhm.
But then, if you wrote a couple of days prior to, maybe the acceptance date changes. So you should go back in and just revise what the dates are.
Okay.
And then have the buyer go ahead and sign off on it.
Especially as a new agent, you're probably going to put it all together thinking it's good to go. You send it over to the broker. They find little things that need to be changed, comes back to you. So there's always way more lag time from the time that you start to put it together before you get it out to your client for signature. There's always going to be a little bit of lag time. So, yeah, just be aware of that. And then property address, tax map key. Okay, and then under that, this is kind of important, right? So this purchase contract, it's important for a couple of reasons, and it tells you that it should be important because it's all in caps and it's in bold, right? And best practice for me when I'm working with a client, whether it's a buyer or a seller, I read this whole thing verbatim to them. Okay, so this purchase contract becomes a legally binding contract for the purchase of real estate upon execution by the parties. Read it carefully. Handwritten or typed provisions in this purchase contract shall supersede any printed provisions if there is a conflict. Okay, so be aware of that. So if you're doing any like special terms, that's what it's saying, right? If it's pre-printed or handwritten, it's going to take precedence over anything that has already been pre-printed on this contract. Fill in all blanks. Paragraphs preceded by checkoff boxes are optional and must be checked to be made part of this purchase contract. Write NA if not applicable. So here's my Tony story for you guys, right? So I came from what used to be Better Homes, then went to Coldwell Banker, and then we joined Keller Williams as a team. So the HAR team joined Keller Williams. Tony was the principal broker. I wasn't as thorough in the beginning. I relied on the brokers to catch my mistakes, which is just not a good way to do things, but that's kind of what I did. So I wrote my contract up, sent it up to Tony, comes back with all these things that are missing. In particular, he was telling me that I didn't check off, as an example, I think it was E2, which are all the inclusions. So I didn't check that first E2 box. And he was kind of telling me, hey, if you don't check that box, nothing applies under E2. So that's my first introduction to you.
That was kind of fast. Page 1.
So just make sure that you tell your client, hey, it's a legally binding contract. Once it's executed, make sure that all the boxes are checked and write NA if it's not applicable for any provision that has that option.
Yeah. Sometimes we'll get a contract. We're in the special terms. It'll say that any blank spaces or boxes are NA. And you can't do that because what you do is you NA terms of the contract that are either bad for the buyer or bad for the seller. So if it's not going to apply, write NA. If it is apply, just don't be lazy and just, write an X or an NA.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're changing the entire contract. So
Got it. Okay, so let's move on. A1, Sunshine, you're next.
Okay, agency. Buyer and or seller in a real estate transaction in Hawaii may retain a real estate brokerage firm as their agent. In such case, buyer and or seller is represented by the brokerage firm and all of its licensees. The law requires real estate licensees to disclose orally or in writing to seller and or buyer whom the licensee represents. The form of representation may be one of the following.
Okay, can you stop there? So first thing is, it says here that buyer and or seller is represented by the brokerage firm. That's their agent. Yeah, so that's a key thing to understand, that, I'm an agent, right? And I have a client that I bring in as a seller, as an example. Well, yeah, that's my client, but really the relationship is between the seller and the brokerage firm. I'm just an agent for the brokerage firm. Yeah, and that's a key thing to understand when you look at dual agency, which you'll get to, a couple of sections there, but go ahead, Sunshine. Seller's agent.
A seller's agent. Brokerage firm represents seller only unless the disclosed dual agency exists. Seller's agent owes the highest duties to seller, including confidentiality, loyalty, and due care and diligence.
Yep.
B, buyer's agent. Broker's firm represents buyer only unless the disclosed dual agency exists. Buyer's agent owes the highest duties to buyer. Buyer's
Yep.
agent owes the highest duties to buyer, including confidentiality, loyalty, and due care and diligence. C, dual agent. Brokerage firm represents both buyer and seller. This commonly occurs when licensees in the brokerage firm representing seller have buyer's clients looking for types of property similar to the seller's property. In such event, the brokerage firm and all of its licensees represents both buyer and seller and are dual agents. Dual agents must remain neutral in negotiations and must not advance in the interest of one party over the other. Written consent is required under Hawaii law, CRR 221, dual agency disclosure and consent.
So do you guys all understand that one? Because that one gets very
complicated.
nebulous. I mean, as agents, right? Let's say I'm working on a deal, and another agent from KW out of another office is representing the other side. I would say majority of the time, agents feel that it's really not a dual agency, that they will represent their client as best they can, even though it's one agency that represents both buyer and seller. And if you read what dual agency it says in the contract, you are supposed to remain neutral.
And that's covered in the dual agency agreement, which will
Addendum.
probably at some point in time go away and become designated agency. For those of you who have not yet written a contract, are you familiar with the standard addendum, the KW standard addendum? Okay, they have a section in there about agency where seller is being represented. However, we may represent other sellers on the same street, same neighborhood, similar properties, same thing for the buyer. So they're trying to cover all aspects. And that's the reason why I think that dual agency at some point in time will just go away and it'll just be strictly designated agency, where the agents can be from the same company and they can advocate on behalf of their client. Because dual agency, you have to remain neutral. You can't even suggest a price. You can't even tell the seller what to counter the buyer for. If there's a situation that arises, you can't give them any advice. You just have to kind of remain neutral and just get an attorney involved. And that's where most of the lawsuits happen, is in dual agency.
And when you're a new agent, right, you really don't see that as a dual agent type of scenario when you don't even know it's KW. So you're thinking, why is it dual agency? Well, earlier, right, it talked about the definition of a dual agency or who the clients are working with. So the clients are working with the brokerage. So that's why if I have two clients, one buyer, one seller, and it's both KW, that's what creates a dual agency, even though the agents themselves are different agents. You also have dual agent, dual agency, dual agent, where one agent is representing both buyer and seller. So that gets it's really the same rules apply, but that gets even trickier because you're having to converse with both sides.
So I would recommend, highlighting the section in dual agency where it says dual agents must remain neutral. In negotiations, it must not advance the interest of one party over the other. And there's a separate written dual agency agreement that gets attached to the contract, and it really specifies what agents can and cannot do. And a lot of times a buyer and a seller would say, well, I don't like that. I don't like dual agency. I want you to represent me and only my best interest, and let the other agent represent their buyer. And that's where a designated agency is coming in.
Okay, the last section, the D.
No agency representation. Buyer or seller is a customer.
Okay.
See paragraph B2.
So that's where somebody comes in and says, I don't need an agent. And typically you would see that if you have a listing and somebody comes in and says, I want to buy it. I don't have an agent and I'm going to represent myself, not a realtor. So they'll check the box further down and say, no representation. Okay, in the back, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Jim Gomez.
Hi.
The singer?
Yeah. Age to disclosure. In our code of ethics, buyer and seller are aware that the National Association of Realtors holds its members accountable for their actions through a strict professional code of ethics, which includes a grievance system to address complaints. Non-members are not held at the same standards as members, nor are they required to participate in the grievance system. Go ahead.
Yep, go ahead.
Seller is and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is not a member of the National Association of Realtors. B, buyer representation. Buyer is represented by the brokerage firm X and all of its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of the National Association of Realtors. C, dual agency representation. Seller and buyers are represented by the brokerage firm X and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of the National Association of Realtors. A separate dual agency disclosure and consent is required. D, customer no agency representation. Seller is not represented by brokerage firm. Parentheses, for example, for sale by owner. Buyer is not represented by a brokerage firm. Buyer and seller acknowledge that oral written disclosure relative to agency representation was provided to them before the signing of this purchase contract. It is recommended that buyers and sellers consult with legal counsel prior to signing a purchase contract. Initials below for legal disclosure number and Section B, initial earnest money deposit. Initial earnest money deposit, sorry, B1.
You can stop there.
Thank you. You're awesome.
So on section C, and I don't know if Chad had gone over this in his class, for those of you that were here. We're, as a brokerage company, we're getting away from dual agency, but the new contracts haven't come out yet where they do have a designated agency on there. So they have a provision, I think that's in the standard standard verbiage that they put into for the contract, but right in here that buyer and seller represented by the brokerage firm by way of a designated agency agreement. And what that means is that if Ken is representing the seller and I'm representing the buyer, he can advocate for his client, the seller, and I can advocate for my client, the buyer. I can advise them what to offer, what to counter offer. If there's a provision like, hey, this is to your benefit, just let it ride out. Don't do anything and let the sellers like renege or they'll be obligated. Like you can't do that in a regular dual agency situation, but designated agency you can.
Okay.
Yes.
You said that we're moving away from that. Is that as a firm, Hawaii, or all the real estate firms in Hawaii?
I want to say like a lot of the larger firms have already started doing away with dual agency. As of maybe about a year ago, and there's gonna be a provision in the contract that's coming, the newest version, to just do designated agency.
So
Designated agency.
in a situation where the brokerage firms are deciding that as opposed to the state of Hawaii or the Board of Village firms, like how does that work? Is it like who controls that kind of decision?
The brokerage,
So
company.
collectively, it
Collect-
sounds like that's what brokers are.
yeah, because most lawsuits happen because of dual agency, like the buyer feels like they weren't fully represented or the seller feels that they weren't fully represented because the agents have to remain impartial. But in designated agency, they no longer have to do that. Yes, Charmaine.
Dual, right?
I was gonna mention your name, but being that you brought it up, I want to say something about Charmaine. So Charmaine specializes in Hawaiian homes. And I review her contracts. And I don't know how she gets all the sellers and the buyers, but the majority of the contracts that come in, she represents the seller and the buyer is not represented, is the customer.
I try my darnest to keep that separate. I don't like doing dual agency. Because it's, as realtors, we don't mind getting both sides, right?
Sure.
We get the calls from our listings. But if something goes south, that's the liability there. So a lot of companies out there don't even allow their agents to do dual agency because the risk is so high. And so I always, if it's my client and I've taken them out looking at properties, I have a relationship. I cannot do customer, right? Because I have a relationship with them. But if it's one that calling in on my listing, they're automatically gonna be a customer. So that's.
And you explained that up front, right?
Yeah. Because I have, I don't do dual agency. I represent my client, which is the seller oftentimes. But it's always that you taking that risk if you do both sides, because even if they're a customer, they still relying on you for information.
I was gonna say, that's tricky.
Yeah.
So it's very, even if they're a client, customers, relying on you for information. And
Yeah.
gotta watch, and it's not something that you wanna,
Can't take it lightly.
Who doesn't wanna get both
Right.
sides of the register? Right now, I would refer a buyer from an agent on another company because it was her listing and her buyer. And she, there's always, anything can go south. So she asked me to represent the buyer, and that's really smart because the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 commission is gonna be nothing compared to what you're gonna have to pay.
Oh, yeah.
if it goes south.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you've been involved with a lot of
Lawsuits.
arbitration
Mhm.
lawsuits and it's just not worth it. I mean, the amount of time and money that is gonna be sucked out of you. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's safer, yeah. Yeah.
Or you can treat them as a customer, like Charmaine does.
Yeah.
And get both sides.
Treat them as a customer, you can still represent them.
You can. You want to take that over?
Well, if we call you on your listing, so you have no relationship with that, so you can write the offer for them and you explain to them, I represent the seller. But I can write the offer for them. I cannot advise you, but I will put it in the offer, whatever you ask.
Strictly all their terms,
Exactly.
price and everything,
Yeah.
whatever you want,
You
but yeah,
can let
whatever you
give
get,
them advice.
that's a customer,
That's a customer.
and you would
And
tell
they
them.
need to understand that.
Mhm.
And sometimes they want to get their own representation. But other times you're a specialist, like for me, I wanna work with you.
Mhm.
So they become a client, a customer, and it works.
And they don't mind that, because
They don't mind, and they're free to go and get their own agent, but oftentimes they don't want to.
I think that, the key to any negotiations, whether it's with the other side or even with your client, right, it's setting expectations. And I think because you have the experience on how to do that, you've already set expectations is what they should expect. in a client or in a customer relationship. I think the key to also remember is in a customer relationship, you're not supposed to advise. But if you do, then you become liable for that advice that you give. So think of it this way, right?
They come to you directly as a seller's agent, because they thinking in their mind, they got the edge.
Right, like, when you get the sellers.
Yeah, they thinking in their mind, we don't need another agent, because, you know, they want that edge, right?
Very dangerous.
Yeah, so can,
Like I said, other companies, they won't even allow their agents to do agents.
Yeah. So as new agents, and it can be tempting, because now you're gonna double your commissions to consider a dual agent, or maybe there's a scenario where they're saying, no, I'll just be a customer. I would advise you to talk to the senior agents within the firm, to ask for advice on how to maneuver through that process, if you choose to do that, because it can be very, very tricky. Yeah, so just a bit of caution.
And when we talk about representing somebody, you know, whether a customer or as an agent, as long as you stay within the terms of it, like if a customer has a question with regards to the contract itself, go back to that provision. You know, because you can advise them on what their options are within the contract, but you can't. Like if I'm representing a buyer, Kent's representing a seller, and Kent tells me something about the seller that he's not supposed to, being a dual agency, I can't use that information and advise my buyer. But if there's something in the contract that he represents a seller and I represent the buyer, and my provision is for the buyer, I can definitely advise my buyer, you know, what their options are within the contract. So,
Okay, let's move on to B1. Yeah.
what is your name? I'm sorry.
Jeff,
Jess.
Yes.
Thank you, Jess.
B1, initial earnest money deposit. Buyer's initial earnest money deposit shall be processed as follows. Choose one. Buyer's agent has received a check from buyer, which shall be deposited with escrow by the next business day after the acceptance date, or buyer shall directly deliver a check to escrow by the next business day after the acceptance date, or buyer shall wire the initial deposit into escrow's account within X business days after the acceptance date.
Tony, is there,
Yes,
which one do you prefer?
as a brokerage company, we prefer that buyers don't take any checks from the clients. Because then you're responsible for
Buyer's
it.
agents.
Buyer's agents. Because then you're responsible for it. And if you do have a check, it's actually supposed to become to the brokerage company. So I would just ask the buyer, do they feel like going to escrow the following day? Or do they need a couple of days to wire the money in? So, and then wiring is usually good because escrow will come back and, you know, you have proof that you sent it, and escrow will come back and prove that they have received it. So my preference would be to wire.
Okay.
If it's a big amount, if it's like, you know, $1,000, if you're working with a VA buyer, small amount of down payment, then, you know, maybe they want to go take a check in.
Yeah.
But just make sure they can do it the next day.
So if they don't make it the next day, Tony, what happens?
Seller has the right to cancel.
And if it's, you know, maybe not right now, but last year, it's so competitive that sellers
Will cancel.
yeah, would possibly cancel if they get a better offer from somebody else. So just be aware of those. Be aware of all timeframes on the contract.
Because you had somebody cancel, right? We'll get to that in section C.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. That's the one that I wrote down.
Okay.
Okay, Jess, why don't you, oh, go ahead.
I have a question. So you guys were saying at the beginning, you guys like the NA in like the white box as opposed to anyone.
Well, when there's so in section, like in B1, you're given, you know, 3 choices, right? Just check one. And that's the one that applies. You don't have to do NA on the other 2. Yeah. What we're talking about NA is that if you go like paragraph E2 or E3.
Or D1.
Yeah,
Let's go further down, D1. Because it's all that apply, right? NA if not applicable. Whereas B1, it's choose one out of the 3. Yeah.
how do we give them the information? So like buyer shall wire to, escrow account?
Mhm.
Where does that information come from?
From escrow,
Great question. Yeah. So,
like, go ahead.
no, just be careful with all this wire fraud these days. What I do is I let the client know. If you want to wire, you need to contact escrow, and here's the escrow officer. Make contact with the escrow officer, make sure that you're getting information directly from that officer. And also, especially if it's a big amount, you're calling to verify before you send that wire, you're calling to, you, Mr. Client, are calling that escrow officer to notify, I'm gonna be wiring, and just verify this information. Unfortunately, once it's wired, it's gone. If it goes to the wrong person, too bad. That money is gone. You can't pull it back. So just be very careful if it's a wire, that clients know. Verify, talk to the officer. Don't just rely on email or text messages. Actually talk to the person and just verify.
So if the seller's agent is adamant about using a certain escrow company and escrow officer, contact them ahead of time or give the information to your client. And if not, then just, an escrow officer can be your friend. So, get to know a couple of really good ones. They'll take good care of you throughout the transaction.
Jess, was it? Can you do C1?
So. Section B, offer to buy and purchase price. B1, offered to buy, buyer offers to buy the property described below on the terms and conditions contained in this purchase contract. This purchase contract shall be binding if accepted by seller on or before date and time.
Okay, stop there. So, Tony, what do you recommend in terms of time frame, right? That you would give the other side to respond to the contract?
I would normally call the seller's agent and just say, how long do you need? In a competitive market where there's like multiple offers coming in, you kind of want it like a short time frame, because otherwise they're just going to hold on to it, wait for other offers to come in. But in today's market, unless something is really grossly underpriced, they may need 24 hours or they may need 48 hours. They may have clients that are out of country, military, they're on a ship, can't get a hold of them right away. I've got a new listing coming up where the seller just wants snail mail, like he won't sign anything. So I need a week just to get it to him and get it back.
Wow.
Yeah. Hardcore local guy from conspiracy theorist. So I always call the other side.
Okay.
And just find out.
Okay, cool.
C2, purchase price. The purchase price for the property in US dollars shall be paid as follows. Initial earnest money deposit,
Mhm.
additional deposit paid into escrow by
Mhm.
X. Balance of down payment or balance of purchase price if all cash. Paid in escrow prior to closing. Total cash funds from buyer exclusive of closing costs. And by way of X.
Okay, just read the last paragraph down below.
Should buyer fail to make the initial earnest money deposit or additional deposit when due, seller may elect to terminate the purchase contract pursuant to paragraph O-1.
Okay, thank you. So here's Tony's story number 2. So we had a listing, I think it was on the Eva side, got into escrow with a buyer, and then through J1, seller tells me he does not want to sell. So I'm saying, okay, unfortunately, I told you earlier, right, that it's legally binding once it's executed, so I can try and find a way out. But unless the buyer doesn't fulfill their obligations, you have to sell. I mean, that's what the contract says. I'm not telling you. Just read the contract. That's what the contract says. So we're going through the process of J1. And buyer had committed when they first offered on the property to not ask for anything throughout their J1 home inspection. So I wasn't anticipating anything there. But they did, they came back and they said, you know, the condition was not what they expected, and so they wanted a, I'm making it up, I don't remember the exact number, but a $25,000 credit. So I reported it back to the seller. The seller goes, no, I don't want to sell. Okay, so I'll just tell them no. So went back, told them no, and in the meantime, remember earlier they said they didn't want to sell anyway. So what I told seller is, you know, one way out is if buyer does not fulfill section C2. Right? So they put in their earnest money deposit on time. That was fine. Their additional deposit was due, I think it was on the weekend, Tony.
Oh, yeah, on a weekend.
It was due like on a Saturday or a Sunday. So I called Tony and I said, Tony, seller doesn't want to sell. We haven't received their additional deposit yet. Seller wants to cancel. He goes, okay, well, even though it has already passed, because I think I might have talked to Tony on a Sunday and it was due on Saturday. He goes, you know, even though it is past that date for the deposit to be received by escrow, guess what? Escrow is closed. So he said, to be safe, why don't you wait a couple of days, couple of business days. And if it's still not deposited yet, then you can go through that process. So this is very unusual. I don't know of a lot of people that have canceled based on buyer not fulfilling their obligation with additional deposit. So basically what happened is waited a couple of days, and I had already lined it up with the seller to sign off on cancellation based on this would be based on 01. 01 is one of the cancellation provisions where buyer did not fulfill obligations, right? And we shot it out. And I tell you, shit hit the fan after that. Obviously, buyer was not happy because according to the agent, they had already moved out and they were preparing to move into the home, blah, 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 blah. But the point is, you gotta pay attention to your timeframes, because if you don't, and you're on the side of that agent who wasn't paying attention and did not fulfill the obligations, right? Didn't advise buyer what would happen if they didn't fulfill. Seller had every right to cancel. So we did cancel. And we said, we'll be nice. We'll give you back your deposit. Because what it says here under 01,
Not anymore.
well, it took it away.
Took it away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
back then it was.
yeah,
there.
so Kent, the buyer for Kent's, for this transaction, they had a hard date as to when the additional deposit was gonna be due, and it fell on a weekend. So
Yep.
because of that, we made a policy change. So now if you're representing a buyer, the additional deposit always due X amount of business days after the release of J1.
Yeah.
Because back then, 01, if you didn't fulfill the initial deposit, additional deposit, or couldn't come up with the balance of the down payment, it was automatic forfeiture of all those funds. So they took that out maybe about 2 revisions ago on the contract.
Cool. Okay. That's my second Tony story. And that was a wild one because again, there aren't too many that I'm aware of that have you gone through a lot?
Mhm.
And you've signed off on like thousands of contracts, right?
Contracts, yeah,
And how many times have you seen that happen?
never.
Oh, so I'm the only one?
Yeah. Well, because that's because your guy changed his mind, you know, after acceptance.
That's true.
You know, so we were looking
a way-
for an out. That's the whole thing, right? But if that was like a dual agency situation, like I couldn't give him the advice. I can just say, hey, this is what the contract states. Let your seller know to take a chance,
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
But this way we were firm, like, hey, you can cancel based on this.
yeah. And so it actually happened again. We had another one that we canceled, same thing, same issue. I think they were late on something.
Yeah.
But the key is, if you understand the contract, then you can best represent your buyer or your seller, client, whoever your client is, buyer or seller, right? If you don't know the contract, and let's say later they find out, hey, they could have canceled, that wouldn't be too good. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had a
How
question?
many business days is it after?
I think I see 2, right?
Yeah, 2 or 3.
Typically
Okay,
2.
so after the actual
due date, they're able to do 2 business days over to actually get it in.
Yeah, so let's
Right.
say that J1 expires on Friday, right? Then it wouldn't be Saturday, Sunday that it's due. If it's 2 business days, it would be like Monday, so Tuesday. right?
But you still have to send in the J1 approval by that date, right? Or, disapproval or asking for a credit. So we'll get to J1 because that's kind of a tricky area.
Yep.
But at least as far as the additional deposit goes, always make it business days in case it falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday Monday. Or this past year, like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday were,
Holidays.
yeah, Friday and Monday were holidays for Christmas and New Year's, so.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry, what's your name again? Monica. Okay,
Monica.
Monica, why don't you go and do D1 for us?
Section B, addenda. The following addenda, check are attached to and made a part of this purchase contract. Fill in all blanks, write NA if not applicable. Each attached addendum must be properly signed and initialed as applicable. 1031 exchange, agreement of sale, as is condition, designated agency disclosure and agreement, distressed property, dual agency disclosure and consent, early occupancy agreement, FHA financing, real estate certification, lead-based paint disclosure, ocean front property, plain language, post closing occupancy contract, purchase money mortgage, residential leasehold property, short sale, VA financing, and other.
So go ahead and highlight designated agency disclosure and agreement. So they've already come out with the disclosure agreement. They just haven't changed the contract to implement it, but you can still add it. That's why you put by way of designated agency.
So we have is that
That's a standard form. HAR form.
oh, it's an HR form.
So
Okay.
that's in zip forms.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you'll become familiar with these addendums as your client, as you need to apply them based on what you're gonna be submitting as an offer, right? The ones that you see typically though would be as is, that's pretty standard that a seller would wanna have the as is condition addendum. Lead-based paint, if it's anything older than what, 78?
76 or 74?
Was it Charmaine? 78?
78?
78? And then normally you're also gonna have in our KW standard addendum, right? That would be
78, it's in the contract on page number 7.
78.
Yeah.
What else? So normally when I'm submitting or reviewing this contract with a buyer or a seller, I'm going through this whole thing, but much quicker. I'm not going through it like how we are now. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights. And so what I'm telling them is, here's what we've added in on the contract, and then I'll cover it at the end. And you still want to go through the addendums with your client. Yeah.
Provision D1 and E2. Those are probably the only 2 provisions that will tell you to write NA for all the blank that's not included, appliances and the addenda.
Mhm.
And the reason is for that is that if there was a discrepancy, you could have 2 attorneys argue that a central AC conditioner should be included if it wasn't NA. Because it says just everything that is not applicable, write NA. And I've seen that. I've seen attorneys look at the contract and they'll have 2 different opinions until the buyer and seller come to some sort of a resolution.
All right, so who's next?
Emily,
Hi, Emily.
Emily,
P1, description, tax map key, divisions, section that parcel in CPRs, if applicable. All of that certain check either the simple leasehold property described as follows.
And then we have recommended language, right, on how to
Yeah.
properly describe either
Yeah.
a single family home or a condo. So where would they find that?
for years of practice. No, I think it may be in there's a in the clauses, in the zip form clauses.
Okay.
section, please.
Yes.
Maybe you wanna tell what,
Oh.
addendums,
Oh.
that we have standard,
Yeah,
KW.
Yes.
thank you.
Mhm.
So for these, we have standard addendums. And there's a lot of them that are probably, some of them are in zip forms, some are not. But anything from the Keller Williams standard addendum. If you're dealing with the probate sale, there's an addendum for that, which explains exactly what happens in probate court, that commissions are not what they are until the judge approves them. There's a land addendum, vacant land addendum, which is really, really detailed. So I would look at zip forms, to see what's in there, and also on the KW intranet, there's a whole library of forms that can be used, because they're really, really detailed, and it's hard for people to get them under the special terms.
Correct.
First of all, title. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, lead-based paint, if it's old enough.
But these are the ones that are not on here. Yeah,
Our in-house addendum,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
which are the standard.
KW standard for sure,
oh, and
right?
the other one too is the
Affiliated.
the DPP one for Department of Permitting and Planning, the
Short-term rental.
short-term rental
Short-term rental.
disclosure. Yeah, yeah, it should be on all of them.
So we fill these out in other. Every.
Yeah, you put an X and then
Yep.
add, you put add
Yep.
KW standard addendum, add the DPP.
The intranet, somebody's maintaining that.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like they would grab an old form then.
No,
Okay.
no. The description in like in E1, it's really important to have the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms. If it's a carport, if it's a garage, if it's one car or two car. If it's a condo, is it a covered stall? Is it a sign? Is it uncovered and a sign? What we don't put in there is we don't put anything that can be changed, that can't be verified, like maintenance fees, property taxes.
Mhm.
Parking stall number, square footages or no. Cause there was a big lawsuit in California. Where the square footage was off by. Like a couple of thousand square feet on a single family dwelling.
Couple thousand?
Yeah, it was a big house. It was like, 20,000 square foot house. But anyway, that was with a Coldwell banker on the mainland. And that resulted in like several $1 million.
So if you get a contract in with square footage from another agent, it's Connor.
Connor it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and property taxes, because anything that can change, if property taxes are $50 today, and by the time you close, they go up to 60, they're gonna hold you to the 50. For like the next 30 years. That's what they're gonna try and do.
So can you list again, I'm sorry, what to include, it's bedrooms, baths.
Bedroom, bathrooms.
We should get you
Yeah.
samples of the condo and of the single family. Yeah, so, there are certain things that you kind of want to have as, I don't want to say a template, because especially as a new agent, you don't want to be relying on templates. You want to be able to understand how to fill out a contract. And then later on, almost becomes a template in your mind because you know exactly how to fill it out. But there should be language available to all of you so that you don't have to wing it. Right? It's standard. That's why it's going to be single family home, 2-car carport, 3
Yeah, like
bedroom,
for a
2
single
bath,
family home,
whatever.
I would do all that fee simple land to include a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Home with an attached 2-car garage and all improvements thereon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a copy of it.
Yeah, if it's
somewhere.
a condo, it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. 2-bedroom, 2-bath condominium apartment and fee simple development known as to include 1 covered parking stall.
Regarding like condo parking as an example, especially if you're representing the buyer. And I always try and get whatever I can into the deed if possible. So I'll contact escrow and say escrow, they're saying it's stall 21. I want to have that in the deed. And so it requires a seller to do a little bit more work. But what happens is at least the buyer, once they close, has title specifying that stall number. So there's no issues down the road. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of how stall numbers may end up what you see when you go into the building, but it could be where when the developer built the building and labeled all the stall numbers, let's say they labeled it based on the apartment number or the condo number. And so, and then, a management company takes over and they go, that was great when it was first built, but I don't like it because it's not a real secured building. And what happens is if there's no car in that stall, then a robber knows, hey, that unit may be empty. So they change it. They go, okay, instead of unit numbers, we'll go like a letter and a number, or a number and a letter. And so all these things could happen. Another thing that could happen is I own, this unit and my stall is over here. Tony owns this unit and his stall is over here. And we keep running into each other and we go, hey, why don't we just switch stalls? So we end up switching stalls and we lived there for 30 years. And everyone says, oh yeah, that's my stall. He tells Tony that's his stall. Or Tony tells people that's his stall. And then that's how it's listed. And then that's how it's sold. And then come to find out, well, we made this deal earlier and we forgot. And so it could run into all kinds of problems. So try and do that if you can. Especially if you go from if your buyer, I've heard this before, where seller said it includes a covered stall. But the reality is that wasn't their stall. Their stall was actually uncovered. So that's a big problem, right? Especially if you like your car to be parked under.
Yeah, and title companies, they won't insure parking stalls anymore.
They
may-
will. Oh, but they'll include it on the deed. They will.
As long as they have the original
Verification.
verification with the original condo map.
It's a business deal. Because my son's girlfriend just bought. And I told escrow I want the stall number in there. So what escrow wanted was seller disclosure with the stall number and verification from the building manager that that's the stall. And then they ran with that and they included number.
No, you're lucky.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those where, yeah, they don't like to do that. But if you have a good relationship with the escrow officer and you just ask them, I would say that they will at least try. Won't guarantee it, but they'll at least try.
Okay. Any other questions on that before we move to E2?
So we've been going an hour. Do you guys need a break or should we keep going? Keep going?
Okay,
Okay, let's go.
E2.
Who's next?
Into inclusions, sale include all building furniture, attached existing fixtures, built-in appliances, electrical, gas and plumbing, and pavilion, in the following individual items. Seller did not substitute any inclusions, fill all the blanks, write NA is not a big.
Yeah, I don't think you need to read all of them. But just know that if it applies, it should be checked. So one thing that I normally would do is I'd follow MLS. I'd have the printout. And as I'm filling out this contract, I'm making sure that whatever's on MLS is checked off here. And I've typically already gone to the unit or to the house, whichever. And if I've noticed something that is not on MLS, but it's at the house or the unit, then, I mean, it's a judgment call, but I'll typically check it off as included as well. Right?
Some
Is
agents,
that what you do?
yeah, some agents will also write if attached as attached. Because, sometimes you walk into a house that had a nice big bathroom mirror and then right before closing, it's gone. So that may be something that you wanna, put in there under other, if attached as attached.
I have a funny story on this one. So, because you said if attached as attached, right? So
Mhm.
includes all built-in furniture, attached fixtures, built-in appliances. So basically everything that's kind of stuck to the house, right? So we have this property in Mililani that we listed. And we're about to close. And buyer does their final walkthrough. Buyer's agent calls me and says, "Hey Kent, what happened to the rocks?" And I go, "What rocks?" He goes, "Oh, there were rocks on the side of the house that are no longer there." I'm like, "All right, so what do you want me to do about it?" He goes, "Oh, you need to replace them. You need to have the seller buy the rocks and replace them." So I'm going, "Oh my God, did the seller take like these large moss rocks, like a rock garden kind of deal? Back the truck up and load these tons of rocks on?" I'm sorry?
You take the potted plants too, so you gotta write it all in.
Yeah, no, so what happened was, when I asked them, I go, "Describe the rocks to me." Oh, there are about like 4 or 5 of them, like, and they give me the measurement. So it ended up being like rocks, like these kind of rocks. I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" I said, "Read the contract. Is it attached?" "No, it's not attached." "Why are you guys making a big deal out of this rock?" So again, know the contract, and you're gonna have all kinds of situations that come up. It's really wild to see some of them.
They want plants, some people dig the plants out.
Yeah,
They want plants, and you should put it in.
Yes. So yeah, from that, right? Anytime there's a question, because of that story I gave you, that's what I do. If it's questionable, then we write it in.
Take
just to make
pictures-
sure.
we take pictures of the appliances, so oftentimes they like to switch it out.
switch it out.
I have that big time cup.
Yeah,
Beautiful,
they like to switch it out,
6 flame
because their auntie wants that one,
Yeah.
and she'll switch it with that one.
gone by the time walks.
Oh, no way.
Remember there was.
Are you seller or buyer?
No, buyer, there was this Ross appliance. on
Oh,
the
yeah.
house Who had this stinky little, put that in, there was a big space, there was a big little,
So what happened on that?
what we call escrow immediately, final walks, we said, hold on to all monies, we're gonna give you a list of
Excellent,
what we need.
excellent.
Good.
And did they bring it back?
No, we got, I don't know.
Oh, credit for it.
$1,000 to buy appliances. Everything gone, the big fridge, the place was stinky stuff.
Wow.
So, I mean,
Washer fire completely gone.
I think that's, just miscommunication between seller and agent. Because agent got advised, right? Seller.
The problem is open sellers who are made that.
Oh, because they're used to that.
They're used to that.
They're used
Oh,
to
yeah,
that.
they hate their own appliances.
Yeah, on the main, a lot of times, appliances are not included with the sale of real property.
They think that when they purchased it, it didn't come with the house, then that's theirs to
Yeah.
give away, actually.
Yeah.
'Cause I had one like that, I told them, the washer dryer, the contract is included, right? Yes, come closing, no washer dryer. Activated a washer dryer. I had to buy one,
Yeah,
my seller.
Oh, yeah,
I had
yeah.
to do the same thing.
Sometimes they just don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that like middle of the mainland?
Well, California's not like that.
I know,
Texas,
yeah,
Texas.
Texas.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Even if you're a tenant in Texas, you gotta bring your own appliances. Love Texas for that. At the same, going back to E2, like we're talking about, things that are included, if you're representing the seller, pay attention to what they're asking for. Cause if they put something in there
And
that's
it's
not there,
Yes. Good
you
point,
gotta
Ron.
buy something,
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Because this
just-
is the contract. So let's say they checked off a TV and they're like, "Oh, there's no TV." Well, guess what? They're gonna point to this and say, "Well, you also TV."
Right. And the contract is between the buyer and the seller, but if you make a mistake, your client's gonna come after you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
E3,
Always get it
yeah.
in right. That's they might say, oh, the TV's staying, the 3 TVs in the house staying, they have to get that in writing. Cause usually it's not in the initial,
right,
but comes about during the transaction, or just leaving it,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially TVs.
Yeah, because
To the wall.
back in the day, it was it was on a shelf, right? It was the big tubes, and now they're flat and they're like pieces of. It's like an artwork now, so you can just hang it. So that's
A lot of times they wanna leave it because they don't wanna cover the hole.
yeah, and
Well, there is a good question when it says as is where it's attached. Is it the mount that is attached and you can take the TV?
Yeah, so not- yeah. I didn't think about that one. You just get a mounting bracket with no TV.
I mean, I would argue that TV's included. It's mounted. It's attached.
It's attached,
It's attached. That's what I would argue. I mean,
unless it's just floating there with magnets.
it could be like, okay, then I can take the dryer and just leave the plug.
Yeah,
Oftentimes they take it.
yeah.
Yeah,
leave
yeah,
them out.
yeah.
So this if attached as attached statement, do you put something specific or is it, it's just a blanket statement? If attached as attached?
Well, after today's class, I'm gonna say that you should probably, yeah, you should probably specify, yeah.
Are you still reviewing contracts for
Yeah.
agents?
Well, because it says like attach existing fixtures to include built appliances, electrical, gas and plumbing fixtures, but if you have somebody that takes off all the bathroom mirrors, like that's not covered in here. And there's nothing in here in E2 that says I can't take my bathroom mirrors. Right? So that's why it doesn't cover everything, but at least it will cover the bathroom mirrors.
Was that where, the difference in the definition between a fixture and,
Because
is that where this falls, is the inclusion section? Is it like, fixture versus, I think other.
the fixture would be like a light switch or a light, light fixture, kitchen light or, faucets,
Fixture
in the
versus
kitchen.
appliance? No.
like a bathroom mirror.
Pictures and then.
Personal property,
Maybe,
What's that?
pictures of personal property.
maybe,
Yeah,
yeah, it's fixture versus personal property.
yeah, personal property would be, dressers, clothing. I want that shelf over there, I want that statue of Santa Claus or whatever.
So air would be considered a fixture, so it should be included.
Again, two people argue that it's not a fixture. It serves no purpose other than covering some wall space so you can look at yourself as you brush your teeth or shave or comb your hair. And we've seen people argue over the smallest thing.
And if they really wanted that antique mirror that belongs to their great grandmother, then they should list it in exclusion.
Exclusions.
Yeah.
Well, the definition, so a picture is an item that is physically attached to the house. So you could argue that a mirror is physically attached, so you wouldn't need to put it in it.
Right, but you have the other side saying that it's not really attached.
It's hanging.
It's hanging from a nail in the back on a wire.
Yeah.
Which would then be personal property as defined, can be removed without making changes to physical structure.
But you're gonna have a seller and a buyer argue over it.
Yep.
And as the agent for the buyer or the seller, you're gonna have to kind of come to hit them with some sort of a realization.
It almost makes sense to just set the expectation with the
Yep.
client, the seller agent to say, if there's anything here that you like, just need to write it.
Right.
Yes.
Anything you wanna take.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is key. That's what I tell sellers. If there's anything that you wanna take that's questionable, you gotta let me know so I can put it in a contract. Because otherwise, buyers are walking in, they're gonna assume that they're gonna get a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I want that Porsche.
It's in the photo in the garage, right? All right,
okay.
E3.
I'm Chris.
Hey,
Hey,
Chris.
Chris.
E3 included the photovoltaic system and or security alarm system contracts with these. Sellers shall provide applicable documents, including most recent statements for any of the following: lease photovoltaic system, lease alarm system, energy purchase photovoltaic agreement, other. Sellers shall provide documents indicated above to buyer and notify service providers of this purchase contract no later than blank days after the acceptance dates. On receipt of the documents provided, buyer shall have blank days to terminate this purchase contract pursuant to paragraph 02. If buyer does not terminate, buyer shall apply for transfer of service within 3 business days after buyer's approval of documents.
So with regards to photovoltaic systems, there should be a separate addendum that covers photovoltaic systems. And one of the issues that's coming up now is some subdivisions were done where they didn't really have net metering agreements complete with HECO. And so now buyers are getting bills. And you know, they're told that my bill was only $26, but now I'm paying like 200. And so that's an ongoing issue at the moment that just sort of happened just recently. So it's really important in sales real property disclosure statement that they disclose everything with regards to the net metering photovoltaic system is at least. The other thing too is that I'm not sure if it's this contract, but the other contract was that I sold a property where it was a lease system and the buyer had the right to not assume it and ask for the seller to remove it from the roof. So my seller had to pay for all the rest of the lease in order to close the transaction. I'd never seen that before.
So that was something that they wrote into the contract?
It came up later on.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, I don't like the terms of the
Yeah, yeah.
I don't like the terms of the structured lease." So yeah,
Photovoltaic,
photovoltaic.
PV.
So solar panels. are a different section.
I think it's all the same now, but before solar meant that it used to just
Solar
heat
water.
solar water. But now we
Versus
call everything
photovoltaic.
photovoltaic because it has to do with electricity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, this section here is, basically another out for the buyer. Right? Because they're gonna look at the house, they're gonna see that PV is included, blah, blah, blah. So my word of advice would be, whether you're the seller or the buyer, you need to understand what is that agreement? If they have a PV system, what does that agreement say? Or if they have a home security system, what does that agreement say? Some of them are nasty, that's why, right? They'll be locked in for X amount of years and, their cost is fixed. And if you want to terminate early, guess what? You got to pay it all off. So there's no breaks. So be aware of what that contract says, right?
Yeah, security alarm systems is a biggie. But sometimes it's not paid off and the seller still owes money and they have a locked in.
Amount,
contract.
yeah.
So they sell, they should have it paid off.
Yeah, otherwise buyer
What if
now
I-
becomes
if I was-
responsible, right?
If I was. Buyer, I would have to pay it off.
Yeah.
They don't like the monthly payment.
Yeah.
They have to pay.
So just be aware of that,
Where is that on the contract? Say if there is, so,
they need to give you a copy.
okay.
Yeah, so what this says is that, once you get into escrow. Or once you have an agreement, then they need to provide you with that documentation. And then you're gonna fill in how much time you want to review it.
And that's the same thing for the PPs. I don't understand how the Tyler had, like, if they had time to review and approve it.
because the sellers didn't give them the information up front.
Or they
During
didn't-
the J1 inspection, they dragged their feet because they couldn't get the information from, and that's the other thing too, is a lot of these PV companies, they don't exist any longer. And so the main ones are like Sunrun, and there's a couple of other big mainland companies that have come in. They're not easy to get a hold of.
Mm.
Right? So it's really important that you kind of tie everything into your J1 inspection period and give everybody as much time as they need. I remember like last year and the year before, everything was like, yeah, I'll just do a 5-day inspection. We'll take everything, but that's not the case any longer.
And there's different net metering agreements, right? So real quick, so you have like a NEM is a net metering agreement. So I have one that was the original one, which is great to have because I consume and I put back, and HECO will pay me the same amount, regardless of whether I'm using HECO's electricity, or if I have excess and I give back to HECO, they're gonna credit me the same amount per kilowatt. Later, they said, oh, we gotta kind of cut back a little bit. So HECO said, you can consume at this rate, but when you produce and you put back on our grid, I'm only gonna credit you this much. So that's the second, I think, agreement. And then now it's like there are no
Right.
put back onto the grid because it's fully saturated, right? So now all you can do is put a battery in. And then whatever you make, you consume and excess gets put onto the battery, right? So
So a lot of my clients have been getting bills. Where they had like $25 or 26, what was the minimum? Now they're paying like a couple hundred. Because all those agreements that were previously done with HECO, they no longer exist.
Wow.
Or the changes that they made.
Getting back to E2, I normally put, auto garage.
Yes,
Mm, yeah. So the other thing you can put is like 2 complete sets of keys.
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah.
Two auto garage to.
Yep.
But then they'll tell you, oh, I can't find the auto.
Yeah.
yeah, each property is gonna be unique as to what's included. Or what not, or what's not included. So you have to be real detail oriented.
So you would call the seller's agent to ask what keys and
All of that.
Or just automatically put it in there. Because the contract only calls, yeah,
Yeah, otherwise they could just give you what they have.
contract only calls for one set.
Mhm.
And just sneak it in there and then say, hey, this is what you guys agreed to. Yeah, put 2 working garage door openers in there, right?
Okay, where are we now? What do we do?
E4.
E4. Okay, who's next on E4? You went already, yeah?
Chris went. E4.
E4, inclusion of furnishings. Inventory of furnishing is attached or to be provided by buyer by date. Insert date. If seller does not provide the inventory list to buyer within the specified time period, buyer may elect to terminate this purchase contract.
Pursuant. Yeah.
To paragraph 03, if buyer is not satisfied with the inventory list, buyer may elect within X amount of days to days after receipt of the inventory list to terminate this purchase contract, to paragraph 02.
So in furnishings, inclusion of furnishings typically would be like places that would do like vacation rentals, where they have furniture, they have like dishes and stuff like that. If inclusions are part of the contract, make sure that on the contract, I mean, you'd have to check with your lender, but lenders typically do not want to see, they want to specifically see that these inclusions have 0 value. So it would have to be written somewhere in the contract, special terms, that inclusions have 0 value. That's what they want to see, typically lenders, right?
If you have furnishings that the buyer wants, the seller says, okay, we can let go of it. We're gonna move and cost a lot of money, they wanna sell, separate bill of sales
Yeah, then you'd try and do that outside of escrow.
outside of.
Yeah. So get some kind of an agreement with the seller outside of escrow.
If you're doing and whatever is gonna be included, take pictures of it, so it's very specific. I mean, right down to when I was doing a lot of vacation rentals in Waikiki, like I would just take pictures of all the forks, all the knives, all the spoons, and just write it on the photo, blow it up and just write it down, because they knew exactly what they were getting.
Yeah, it's very time consuming and what's the word I'm looking for, but it's tedious.
It's very tedious.
Right, it's very tedious.
Right.
So pictures, that's a great solution. And honestly, sellers, especially if either they're not here
Not
or they
here.
don't spend time in the unit, they don't want to be listing everything down. So, but as the agent listing the property, you know how it works. You gotta provide a list, and so that's a great tip, right?
And if you're dealing with owners that don't live here anymore, and then they have a storage unit, check out the storage unit and ask the sellers what's gonna happen to the contents. Because if they're not coming back, because I had clients in Waikiki, they said, we're never coming back. So everything that is here is staying. And we're talking about paper towels, like toilet, like everything stayed. They weren't removing anything. And so whatever I couldn't leave, I had to haul off.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just be aware of all that.
Okay. I'm sorry, what is your name?
My name's Frank.
Frank? Okay,
Yeah.
Frank, why don't you
Well,
do,
I didn't bring my glasses today. I can't even.
you can't
see.
read? Okay, no
Sorry.
worries. No worries. Okay, Charmaine, you can go,
It's,
E5.
P5.
Exclusion, the following items are typically excluded.
So this is what we were talking about, right? If as a seller, there's something that is kind of questionable, you do want to include it here as an exclusion if they're gonna take it with them.
Did this section shrink somehow?
Probably, but I would just go ahead, see addendum 1, add addendum 1.
Which section? E5 or just section E? E5. Well, I have an old contract and it's the same. This is a 2021. It's exactly the same. Yeah. Okay. You wanna continue, Shami?
F1 closing, for the purpose of this purchase contract, closing shall be the date when all appropriate conveyance documents are recorded in the Bureau of Conveyances of the state of Hawaii. The Bureau of Conveyances.
Mhm.
F2 scheduled closing date. The scheduled closing date shall be
So on this one, Tony, do you recommend 45 days from acceptance or do you recommend a hard date?
I like to do 45, whatever the number of days, and it has to be, what your buyer wants, right? If you're writing for the buyer, like X amount of days after the date of acceptance.
Okay.
Because you'll have somebody argue like, hey, you accepted it on Friday at
Mhm.
4 o'clock and now it's Saturday morning, you already burnt the day. Well, no, I haven't really burnt the day. And so even though the contract has something in there to that, so I
Mhm.
always do 30 days after the date of acceptance.
After date of acceptance?
Yeah, so
Oh, after, not,
yeah,
okay, got
so
it.
that means my first day is gonna be the following
So
day, which is Saturday.
11:59 PM is not gonna be acceptance, it'll be the next day,
Right,
a Friday, 11:59, it'll be Saturday. Okay.
and then the other thing too is that we put in there now is property to be conveyed vacant. Because what happens is that, and I got this from an attorney client that I was dealing with, and he said that when title passes, the seller only guarantees equitable title. Right? It doesn't mean that they're giving you possession. You want physical possession as well as equitable possession. So that's why we put it in there to be conveyed vacant.
Yeah, under N, I think it is, either
Well-
rented or vacant.
Right,
Yeah.
but N specifies if you have a tenant.
Yeah.
So if it's a property that's owner occupied, you just want to make sure that by the date of closing, that they move out. I put it right there in F2. This is the closing date, property to be conveyed vacant, so the sellers know they need to get out.
Yeah, because I don't know, sometimes they think that closing is when they get their money and then they have a few days to.
Yeah.
Okay, Charmaine, why don't you finish F2?
F3.
No, F2?
If the scheduled closing date falls on a
Oh,
day the
sorry.
Bureau of Bids is closed, closing would be the next day when conveyance documents can be recorded.
Okay, so when you put in a closing date, and let's say, Tony mentioned, what is it, after, 45 days after, or
After the date of acceptance.
45 days after the date of acceptance? And that date happens to be a Saturday or a Sunday, right? And Monday was a working day and the bureau's open. When would that transaction record?
It means that, it means like a business day after closing to be the recording or something like that.
Well, no, the signing and all that, you're probably talking about signing and funding. But
Yeah.
if let's say that you look at the calendar and based on the language, it said 30 days after acceptance,
The date of acceptance.
after the date of, 30 days after the date of acceptance. Right, is that right?
Yeah.
30, okay, so and that 30th day falls on a Saturday. What date would it record on?
The following Monday.
Yes, so the following Monday. If it said or earlier, then it would be Friday. Right? As a buyer's agent, then that goes to your question about funding, right? So you'd have to fund at least 2 days prior to close, at least 2 days prior to close, normally like 3 or 4 maybe, yeah. But know that, okay, so if I fund on a Monday, Tuesday, maybe even on a Wednesday, I can close on Friday. So escrow will have the money. Buyer does not have the property, but buyer is paying interest on the money that's in escrow because the lender has sent it over to escrow. Okay, and we're not talking about huge money here, but know that if escrow gets the money on Friday or Thursday, you're not going to close on Friday, you're going to close the following week, which then adds 2 more days to escrow holding the money and 2 more days added to that time frame of 2 days at least, business days, that it'll take for the buyer to actually get the property, recording at the property, right? So those 2 days might represent $50-100 in financing fees. So, you know, is it super important? Maybe not, but those are things that you can kind of explain to your client that shows your expertise and shows how much you're trying to look out for their best interest. And, you know, for some,
But it's also important too,
difference.
if it's also important if like the 30th of March is on a Friday,
Mhm.
okay? But if recording is scheduled for Saturday and now they take it to like Monday or Tuesday,
Mhm.
now they're into April.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got like a VA buyer or an FHA buyer, actually any buyer in a conventional, they're gonna have to pay for that whole month of interest up front for April, right? Because interest for the first
Oh,
month
they
is
collect
paid in
what they
advance
collect.
and then it's paid in arrears.
Mm.
So that may really put a damper on a client that
Closing costs, yeah.
closing costs
Total
that can
closing costs.
qualify for the mortgage, just they don't have a lot of cash. And so when you say like within 30 days or earlier, like if the buyer is gonna be closing earlier, you gotta get the seller approval, but he may be counting on taking that weekend to move out. And that's when they're like, no, I'm not moving out. So there's a lot of negotiation after the deal's already in place.
And so your name?
I have Karen.
Karen, why don't you take F3?
F3, okay, change to schedule closing date, choose paragraph F3A or F3B. A, one-time unilateral right to extend. Either party may extend the scheduled closing date up to blank days before delivery of written notice to the other party prior to the scheduled closing date. Once either party has exercised this unilateral right to extend for all or any part of the extension period set forth above, time shall be of the essence, and there shall be no further unilateral right to extend by either party. The scheduled closing date may not be further extended unless buyer and seller agrees in writing. This provision relates to the extension of the scheduled closing date, and timeframes measured from the scheduled closing date shall be measured from the extended scheduled closing date.
Okay.
Did I just finish up there?
Yeah. So that one, it's a unilateral, right? So either party can extend. If this is part of the contract, either party can extend. And typically you're gonna put like 10 days in there or something of that sort. When I was teaching this class, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so, everyone was with this latest verbiage. What some of the guys were doing was, okay, when you have a close date, that's the date. This is the only provision, automatic provision available to either party to extend beyond that date. Okay, and let's say it's 10 days. What some of these guys were doing was they would, because it doesn't require you any justification to use it. All you have to do is ask for it and you get it. But what they were doing is saying, oh, 30-day close, I don't want it to go beyond 31 days. I'm going to use F3A and I'm going to take 1 day and I'm going to burn it 1 day, even though they don't need it. Right? And so that 10 days now becomes only 1 day. For one, and then two, the other side has no ability to automatically extend beyond that. So you can't extend as long as both parties agree to extend beyond that. Because what it says is, once it's used, time becomes of the essence to close.
Now, the previous versions of the contract used to state
You have to justify.
for beyond the buyer or seller's control, and I don't know why they took it
Reasons
out.
beyond.
Beyond your control, right? So now it's just like, okay, I'm just gonna burn off, like as Kent said, I'm gonna burn off 9 days.
Yeah. However, there is a special provisions contract out there. Better Homes.
Yeah, so they put it
They
inside
have
of,
language in there that we can take and use in our special provisions that basically says you can ask for 1 day, but it reserves the right, the other party's right to use the full thing if needed.
Right.
So,
that's why you gotta read the addenda.
oh, yeah. So, as a buyer's agent, you're looking at the main contract, you put your addendums in. And then the other side will counter back with their addendums. It's so important, as Tony's mentioning, to read it all. I'm sorry?
They have their addendum.
Yeah.
We have with our addendum. Can we use two addendums?
Mhm.
I've been using-
Because they may cover, each
Yeah.
addendum may cover specific things that are specific to that company. And not necessarily like general disclosures, like ours is basically like general disclosures, right? But Better Homes and Gardens, they change a lot of the terms of the contract.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
So if there's a discrepancy, who's gonna supersede who?
they're both the same, so if you get a contract with a Better Homes and Garden or a different, Quo Banker, you really have to read the provisions of the contract of what their addendum is, because ours doesn't change anything in the contract.
So if there is verbiage, then
Cross it off. You just, you counter and say, item number 2 is NA,
And counter it
counter
out.
out. Because otherwise you're gonna be stuck with it. And they used to have another one too, where any,
Automatic disclosure?
yeah, like any discrepancies found in the buyer's home inspection is an automatic update to the disclosure statement.
Yeah.
So,
So so Better Homes, if you ever worked with them, they're a good company. They know how to represent their buyer, they know how to represent their seller. They have special addendums specific. One for the buyer, one for the seller. Right? That's how granular they are and how they write their contracts. Right? So you need to read them. Locations as well. They're not as meticulous. But those two in particular change things, not necessarily in the favor of your client. So as an example, Better Homes, they have things like automatic disclosure, right? So anything that is not part of your disclosure statement, we discover throughout the contract term, it's new information, it's automatically a new disclosure. And what that provides the buyer, if you're the seller, the ability for the buyer to cancel, because new disclosure, you can cancel now, right? Other things they do, I've seen where they say, if there's evidence of, okay, so there's a termite provision, and we'll get into this again more later. But in that termite provision, it says that seller needs to abide by the recommendation of the termite inspector. So if the termite inspector says spot treat, seller has to spot treat. If the inspector says tent, seller has to tent. It doesn't say in there that you can cancel based on the termite inspector's report. Now, if there's a new disclosure as a result of that, that's another story. But in Better Homes special addendum, it says if there's live infestation, they have the right to cancel. So things like that, right? Locations will say, oh, in the special provision, they check a box. You got to provide a professional building permits package. And if you don't read it, guess what? You're paying for it. If you don't read it and counter it out, unless you already have it, or unless you're willing to pay for it,
guess what? You are gonna have to pay.
You guys do that in all your contracts.
But it's in their special,
No, I know, but you
Yeah.
guys do it.
so it's like hidden, you know?
Yours,
Because,
yours is in plain sight.
yes, but to me, you're gonna read special provisions.
Yeah,
Not everyone reads, their, what is it, added
they're addenda.
special addendum.
Yeah,
Not everyone goes through it. And all I'm suggesting is that if you don't,
you gotta read
you
it.
might be surprised. Right, so make sure you read everything. Okay. You are
Well, storms.
storms.
What?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can do F4 and F5, please.
Escrow, this transaction shall be escrowed by the escrow company blank. Phone, office, email. The party shall provide to escrow full executed copies of the purchase contract and any addenda or addendums. And documents which are required by escrow by the next business day. The parties further agree to promote, execute appropriate or customary documents when requested by escrow.
You guys all know escrows well. Right, neutral third party. They're there to collect documents from one party and send it over to the other side. They're there to collect money from the buyer so that when it records, they transfer it to the seller, and they're there to work with the bureau to make sure that for the money that the bureau will provide title to the buyer. Right? What else do they do?
They provide a preliminary title report, which shows a legal description of the property as well as any encumbrances. And that could be mortgages, any mechanics liens, tax liens, declarations of CPRs. So a lot of times, if you're working if you have a condo and you get a prelim title report, they have what's called hyperlinks. So if you want to see what the original documentation was when they built it, you just click the hyperlinks. It takes you to like a Google Drive, and you can download the entire document, which is really good because if you're trying to match up parking stall numbers to what is actual and what was told you you're getting, it'll be in those documents. Any encroachment agreements, any easements. If you have a property like in an older neighborhood where you don't own the access, you want to make sure you have an easement in perpetuity to use the driveway to come in and out of your property. All that stuff is covered in the title report.
Yep. And they also provide title insurance.
Title insurance.
So that's just basically making sure that the property can be insured. So if there's ever an issue, they will represent you to resolve that if there's an issue that pops up. And then they have all the previously recorded documents as well that they'll provide in that package. So it may have easement agreements, encroachment agreements as an example. Right, so encroachments, let's say that you're gonna buy a single family home and the neighbor's wall is coming onto your property and it's an easement, an encroachment, but they've already had a recorded agreement on that. Those documents will be part of that package. Yeah, so you'll be able to see that kind of stuff.
Charmaine, Hawaiian Homes. Like you don't get title insurance or anything, right? What about, do they record encroachments? Easements, do they have any of that stuff? No,
They do their own thing at the department.
no, but I mean, like, if I was to buy, okay. I can't buy it, but say I was the owner of Hawaiian Homes, and then my neighbor puts up a wall, do you get a survey?
You can request a survey, because initially when the lease was made, they had a survey. But oftentimes, that's why we pick up surveys, because you're opening up a can of worms. Can't do encroachment agreement.
Oh, you can't,
Because there's no survey.
We don't wanna get them angry, so you're not gonna make them take the wall down.
okay,
So usually you're gonna see in homestead, they take out the survey. I usually leave the survey in if you cannot really see the boundaries. You can't make it out, there's no walls, then I'll ask them to. But if there's walls up, they get out.
okay,
You're opening up a can of worms, because even if there was encroachment, can't do an encroachment agreement, it's used. And one of them is not gonna be in your corner.
Okay, just curious.
Okay, Storm Street, why don't you finish F5?
Operations and closing adjustments based on a 30-day duration, escrow shall prorate the following if applicable. As of the date of closing, real property tax, lease rents, interest on assumed obligations, mortgage, and other insurance premiums, tenant rents, maintenance, private sewer, marina, or associate fees and blank, when applicable, escrow shall charge to seller and credit to the buyer the amount of tenant security deposit.
Okay, perfect. So when you, whether you're buyer or seller, you'll get a preliminary settlement statement as an example, and they'll list all those things. Like if I'm buyer, it'll show that seller had paid real property tax up to, middle part of this coming year or this year. And so you'll see a credit back to buyer, to seller for that, and a charge to buyer, or like maintenance fees that they may have paid for in advance if you're buying a condo, that will be credited back to seller, because you're gonna close mid-month. So money will go back that way. So this is just explaining that these prorations are gonna be made. And then you'll actually be able to see them on the settlement statement.
I like to write on the blank line, because it says marina and or association fees, and I like to write any others to be approved by the buyer. And the reason being is that there are streets in Kaka'ako that are privately owned, so there are fees for those. I sold a condo one time in Waikiki, and there was some sort of like a bird sanctuary fee that I wasn't aware of. Right? So things like that are kind of out of the ordinary. Like, you don't want your client to get some bill or be obligated to pay something that he thought was for free, like the right to access a road.
Okay. So we're gonna close with you. You have like 15 minutes. F6,
You want me to do F6 closing costs?
then we can adjourn.
The following is a list of customary closing costs, including Hawaii general excise tax where applicable, and is not intended to be all inclusive. If closing disclosure requirements apply, buyer and seller are aware that customary closing costs may be reflected differently on the closing statement, on the closing disclosure statement, but the net result will be the same. Escrow may charge the appropriate party other closing costs as directed by the parties. Charged by the buyer if applicable, charged by the seller if applicable. Do I need to read all those?
No,
So
but
they
you
used
do
to,
go over it, right? You go over it
Yeah.
with your client.
and they used to, I don't think this has ever changed.
No, I don't think so.
But before, if you represented the buyer or the seller, like, you got a closing statement specifically for the buyer and one specifically for
Yeah.
the seller. But now a lot of times they include fees on the statement for both parties, but they kind of separate it out. So you can
Yeah.
kind of see what the seller's paying for, what the buyer's paying for. And I'm not sure if that's a disclosure based on Dodd-Frank and all those other things.
Yeah, I
From back in
noticed
the
that the
day.
last time.
But it's like kind of
Yeah.
confusing, because it's kind of like, well, why are these fees here? Because they show credits, adjustments,
Yeah.
They wanna be totally transparent, that was like that big.
yeah.
Show you everything, so it's like everything.
Were you an agent in California?
Yeah,
Okay, so.
You guys, your contract is like 28 pages or 20 something pages?
yeah.
Yeah. Is your contract written by attorneys?
I think
Okay, because they're really fast, and anytime, like, I remember like the COVID addendum came out really quick. During COVID, it took us like 3 months to come up with. It was just like, just copy California. It's like, change one or two words.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Very,
but we don't have attorneys on the committee. That's the whole thing. We have one. But I think in California, because they get stuff done so quickly that they have attorneys on call. So, yes.
Sorry, but back to F5. If you put in that out by buyer, that becomes then an out for the buyer, yeah, it's, the buyer is money.
If he doesn't approve, then yeah.
Buyer can. And all fees and everything would be disclosed at one point, because some of them, I would say, come out maybe later on. Not necessarily disclosed by the seller is not aware of them.
Well, like,
That'll be a new disclosure though, I would
yeah, it's
think,
a new
depending on what it
disclosure.
is, right?
Yeah.
Like a new assessment or something of that sort, yeah.
If you had something that was very obscure, did the seller know about it?
No, and it showed up in the title report,
Okay.
right? And there was like, years ago, there used to be, a fee for the Kakako Improvement Association, right? Or the Waikiki Improvement Association. Well, those things didn't show up, but they show up on the title report. And so the sellers may be paying it, and they don't know what they're paying it for because they've been paying it for so long. But as the buyer, it may not have gotten disclosed by the seller, because my sellers didn't know about the bird sanctuary thing. But the buyer's agent certainly did, and I didn't, so.
Okay, so that we're almost at the 2 hour mark. So, any questions? Yes,
Something you said.
you missed the best part.
Okay.
No, that's
That's okay.
I'm giving you a hard time.
I actually marked what I missed so that I could. finish. The addenda, D1.
Yep.
There was one that was marked also purple, and I see that part, but it designated.
Oh, I said to highlight it. And the reason being is because it's gonna be like the contract just got revised, I think, to add that, but in A2, you have seller representation, buyer representation, dual agency representation. The new contract, whenever it's finished, will have designated agency. And so that's the reason why, instead of dual agency representation, we put seller and buyer represented by the brokerage firm by way of designated agency. And so I wanted you to highlight it to know that there was a separate addendum, for that. Right.
Oh, the other thing that I would mention to a buyer or a seller, as I'm explaining this contract, is under F6, right? I just highlight the main fees that they probably would incur. So I'm letting them know that closing costs roughly 1%, whether you're a buyer or seller. And if it's buyer, I'm saying you're paying 40% of standard title insurance and 50% escrow fees. Right? And then there's others are smaller charges. If it's a seller that I'm dealing with, then I'm telling them you're paying 60% of standard title insurance and then 50% of escrow fees. So the other thing to think about is, since a lot of you have not had any experience writing a contract or presenting a contract, is as you learn more about it, is how to explain the section, to your customer, your client. So just try and keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about, during COVID, as much as everybody hated it, is that, it forced you to not, if you weren't able to meet with your clients, it forced you to have a Zoom conversation with them and read them the entire contract, word for word. And then you're like, oh my, I didn't know that. But you don't say that, right? It's like, I didn't know that. So, but yeah, I mean, the more you look at it, it'll change over time. The better you are. Just, remember certain companies to review their addenda, because they got all kinds of provisions in it that like to stick in. And like it says in the first page, anything printed or written supersedes anything that's here. So, yeah. Okay, well, we hope you found it enjoyable.
Yes, thank you for your
And
time.
next we named, I should have been very specific on brown bag, because you could have brought your lunch. I hope we didn't think that Kent and I were buying lunch for you today.
Well, Tony's buying after this. Where we're going, Tony?
But for next week, feel free to to bring lunches. And then what I'll do is that's in case you all come back, but I will have the office print up the addenda, both from the KW intranet as well as zip forms. so we can get that all to you as well.
So before you go, one quick question. How's the format? You guys like this style of learning?
Yeah.
I mean, it gets very detailed. But I think that's one of the best ways to learn it is to actually go through it line by line. And unfortunately, a lot of people won't if left up to them. So this kind of forces you to go through that.
No, I think
that-
Chad
that
is jealous
process.
that he's not teaching because he had class right before us. Like he scheduled it
When does his class?
at 9:30.
This class?
No, a
Yeah.
different one. Yeah, on the purchase contract. Yeah,
Right.
little bit
But
different
one
one.
day.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, it needs detail.
I know. Okay, thank you.
All right,
everybody.
thank you, everyone.